Sometime in 1979, on a cold night in Little Italy in the heart of Manhattan, a man walked into a dark bar and sat down next to one of the most dangerous assassins in the Bonanno family. They ordered drinks. They talked about American football. They laughed at jokes. The killer called the man Donnie. Donnie Brasco, jewel thief, con man of the streets. A familiar face. Someone you can trust. But Donnie Brasco didn't exist. His real name was Joe Pistone, and he was an FBI agent. That night, while laughing at the killer's jokes, Pistone had a tape recorder hidden under his shirt. Every word was being recorded, every name mentioned, every crime discussed, every secret whispered. Everything would become evidence in court. And the worst part for the Mafia, this had already been going on for 3 years, and it would continue for another 3. 6 years in total. 6 years living as a criminal. 6 years lying to everyone around him. 6 years one step away from being discovered and executed. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It's not the Hollywood movie with Johnny Depp and Al Pacino, although that story is extraordinary too. This is what really happened, and it's much darker, much more human, and much more disturbing than any script could capture. Because after 6 years in the Mafia, Joe Pistone had become so good at being Donnie Brasco that he himself was no longer sure who he really was. Welcome to Files Undercover, the channel where we delve into the most dangerous operations, the most buried secrets, and the stories governments would rather you never know. Today's story is Donnie Brasco, 6 years infiltrated in the Mafia. To understand what Joe Pistone did, you first need to understand what the American Mafia was like in 1976. It wasn't just a group of criminals. It was a parallel government. In New York, 5 families controlled absolutely everything. The Bonanno, the Gambino, the Colombo, the Genovese, and the Lucchese families. Together, they decided who worked in the ports, which trucks crossed the city, which labor unions obeyed whom, which politicians received money, and which received threats. You couldn't move a load of lobsters through New York without paying tribute to the Mafia. You couldn't open a restaurant in the right neighborhood without asking permission. You couldn't exist in business without them knowing who you were. And the FBI could barely scratch the surface of that world. The problem was simple. The Mafia operated on a rule that made any infiltration nearly impossible. The rule was called Omerta, the Code of Silence. To be accepted into the families, you needed to be introduced by someone from within. Without that introduction, you were a stranger. And strangers were dangerous, and dangers were eliminated. The FBI had tried for decades to use informants, inside people who traded secrets for immunity. But informants were volatile. They had limitations. They could be bought back, intimidated, or simply killed before they could testify. What the FBI had never tried before was to place one of its own agents to live inside the Mafia. Not for days, not for weeks, for years. This was considered impossible. Suicidal. A mission that no agent in their right mind would accept. So Joe Pistone volunteered. And here's the question that will guide everything you'll hear today. How does a man maintain 2 identities for 6 years without slipping up even once within an organization that kills people on suspicion? And what happens to this man when the mission ends, but he can no longer find himself? Joe Pistone was born in 1939 in Erie, Pennsylvania, the son of Italian immigrants. He grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, a working-class town with Italian social clubs on every corner. From a young age, he knew the rhythm of that world, how men greeted each other, what respect meant on the streets, the unwritten hierarchies that governed each neighborhood. He studied anthropology in college, worked for naval intelligence, and in 1969 was accepted into the FBI. Over the following years, he specialized in undercover operations. He learned to pick locks, to open safes, to disable alarms, skills that few agents possessed, and that the Mafia desperately needed. In 1976, the FBI was investigating a series of truck hijackings in New York. Entire loads were disappearing: pharmaceuticals, luxury seafood, electronics. It was clearly organized work, and Pistone volunteered to find out who was behind it. The operation was codenamed Sun Apple, a reference to the Miami Sun and the Big Apple of New York, the 2 cities where the investigation would operate simultaneously. The initial idea was simple. Pistone would remain undercover for 6 months, gather information, and then return home. 6 months. That was the plan. The FBI erased Joe Pistone's name from all agency records. Anyone calling inquired about him would be informed that no agent by that name worked there. In his place was born Donnie Brasco, a Miami jewel thief specializing in stolen goods, known in the underworld for his good contacts and skill in burglary. Pistone spent weeks studying gemology, the study of precious stones. He learned to identify fake diamonds, to estimate values with authority, to speak the language of someone who makes a living from stolen jewelry. He memorized the jargon. He adjusted his posture. He bought the right clothes. He needed to be convincing not for hours, but for years. And there was a golden rule the FBI had given him. Never volunteer to do something first. Let them ask. In an organization that distrusts everything, a man who offers himself too much seems desperate. And desperate men are dangerous. The trick was to make himself necessary, without ever seeming like he was trying to be. The gateway to the Bonanno family didn't come dramatically. It arrived the way almost everything in the Mafia does, through a casual conversation in a bar. Pistone, living like Donnie Brasco on the streets of Little Italy, began frequenting the same places the wise guys frequented. Bars, social clubs, restaurants with tables in the back. He didn't approach them. He let them approach him. That's how he met Anthony Mira, a soldier in the Bonanno family with a reputation for being violent and impulsive. Mira was intrigued by Donnie. This guy seemed to know what he was doing. He spoke properly. He dressed properly. He knew the jewelry business. Mira introduced Donnie to a man named Benjamin Ruggiero. Everyone called him Lefty. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was born on Manhattan's Lower East Side in 1926. He spent his entire life in the service of the Bonanno family. A loyal soldier, a reliable enforcer, a man who did the dirty work without complaint. It was said that he had participated in more than 26 assassinations throughout his career. But in 1976, at age 50, Lefty was a frustrated man. He had spent decades serving the family, and the family continued to treat him like a pawn. He was never promoted to captain. He was always indebted to the organization's gambling scheme. Because of his own gambling addiction, a cruel irony for a man who ran gambling operations for the Mafia. His superiors ignored him. His real family barely knew him. Lefty was, in his own words, just a spoke in the wheel. And then Donnie Brasco appeared. The first encounter between Pistone and Lefty took place over a piece of jewelry. Lefty had received a diamond as collateral for a debt and wanted to know its value. Donnie looked at the stone for a few seconds and told the truth. It was fake. That wasn't what Lefty wanted to hear, but it was exactly what an honest jewel thief would say. Lefty was impressed. Here was a man who hadn't deceived him, hadn't tried to take advantage, hadn't lied to please him. In Mafia parlance, this was a man of respect. They went together to confront the club owner who had passed the fake jewelry. Donnie beat the guy up. He took his car as payment. Lefty loved it. From that day on, he decided that Donnie Brasco was his man, his protege, someone he could teach the right way to do things. What Lefty didn't know was that by taking Donnie under his wing, he had just signed his own death warrant. In the months that followed, Lefty taught Pistone everything he needed to know to survive within the Mafia. The rules, the hierarchies, the vocabulary. There was a crucial distinction that Lefty explained early on. Friend of mine and friend of ours. If you introduced someone as a friend of mine, you were saying they were an acquaintance. Someone trustworthy, but not from the world. If you said friend of ours, you were saying that this person was from the Mafia, a member of the family. This distinction wasn't just etiquette, it was a matter of life or death. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could cost someone their head. Pistone absorbed everything. Every detail, every nuance, every unwritten code. And as he learned, he recorded. Conversations in social clubs, robbery plans, names of captains, of bosses, of operations. The FBI was getting an inside look at the Mafia that they had never had before. In 1977, Lefty asked Donnie for an unusual favor, to be his best man at his wedding. Joe Pistone, an FBI agent, a married man with 3 daughters at home, stood beside Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero as he renewed his vows. It was the clearest possible evidence that the infiltration had worked beyond all expectations. Donnie Brasco was no longer just a suspect to be evaluated. He was part of the family. But for Pistone, that moment carried a weight that no amount of FBI training had prepared him for. He was building a real friendship with a real man, and he knew that when the operation was over, Lefty would pay a high price for having trusted him. As the months turned into years, the operation expanded beyond anything anyone had imagined. Pistone wasn't just gathering information on the Bonanno family. He had infiltrated the wider network of the New York Mafia, crossing paths with members of the Colombo, Genovese, and Gambino families. He had participated in gambling, loan sharking, and extortion schemes. He had attended meetings where life and death decisions were made with the same casualness as discussing the dinner menu. And as the years went by, something worrying was happening to Joe Pistone. He was becoming Donnie Brasco, not just in behavior, in mindset. When he returned home to see his wife and daughters, which happened less and less frequently, he could barely hold a conversation. The world of family, of children, of normal daily worries sounded strange, distant, meaningless. The real world for him now was the social clubs of Little Italy, the arguments about who had disrespected whom, the bets, the schemes, the constant dance of loyalty and betrayal that defined life in the Mafia. His wife Maggie noticed. "You're becoming one of them," she told him during a tense encounter during the operation. "Do you know that?" Pistone did not respond. Because she was right. In 1979, the operation took on a new dimension. The Bonanno family was in internal turmoil. The boss had been murdered, a brutal execution that left a power vacuum. Different captains vied for control. Violence was imminent, and Donnie Brasco was in the middle of it all. Captain Dominick, Sonny Black Napolitano, had taken command of Lefty's faction. Sonny Black was different from Lefty, more ambitious, colder, more calculating, and he liked Donnie. This was good for the operation, but it was dangerous for Pistone. The higher you climbed within the Mafia, the more you were expected to prove your loyalty in specific ways. And proving loyalty in the Mafia eventually meant one thing. You needed to kill someone. Orders started coming in. The Bonanno family wanted Donnie to be initiated as an official member, a made man. But to be made a member, it was necessary to have done the bones, to have participated in a murder. In 1981, the pressure reached its peak. Sonny Black ordered Donnie to kill a man named Anthony Indelicato, a rival who had become a threat to the family. Pistone reported to the FBI. The tension within the agency was palpable. For 6 years, they had built the most extraordinary case against the Mafia the FBI had ever had. More than 2 years of recordings, hundreds of names, decades of documented crimes. But there was an absolute limit. The FBI could never allow one of its agents to commit murder. It was time to end the operation. In the last week of June 1981, Pistone received the order. It was time to leave. He would spend his last days gathering whatever final information he could, and then he would simply disappear from Lefty and Sonny Black's lives, without explanations, without goodbyes, without closure. On Sunday, July 24, 1981, Joe Pistone left the King's Court Bottle Club, an establishment his family operated in Florida for the last time. He had spent the previous days with Lefty and Sonny Black. He shook hands. He made jokes. I knew I would never see them again. On July 26, 1981, FBI agents went to Sonny Black's apartment and revealed the truth. Donnie Brasco was a federal agent. He always had been. Sonny Black remained silent for a long moment. Then he said it was impossible. That Donnie was one of his men. That there was an explanation. But when the agents showed him photos of Joe Pistone in FBI uniform, posing with his insignia, Sonny Black understood. He had allowed a federal agent to infiltrate the most famous family in the American Mafia for 6 years. In the unwritten law of the Mafia, there was only one punishment for that. On August 17, 1981, Sonny Black was summoned to a meeting with the leaders of the Bonanno family. Before leaving his apartment for the last time, he called his favorite bartender and handed over all his jewelry. Sonny Black never returned from that meeting. Weeks later, his body was found on Staten Island, his hands severed, the classic Mafia sign for a man who had allowed the organization to get to him. As for Lefty, FBI agents learned that a contract had been placed over his head as well. They intercepted him on August 30, 1981, as he was heading to a meeting from which he almost certainly would not return alive. The FBI offered protection in exchange for testimony. Lefty refused, code of silence, until the end. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 15 years in prison for conspiracy to commit organized crime. In November 1982, at over 50 years old, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero entered prison knowing he would spend more than a decade there. And yet he refused to believe, for a long time, that Donnie had been an agent all along. His lawyer told him that Pistone had testified against him in court. Lefty replied, "He will never turn against us." When he finally accepted the truth, his response was different. "I'm going to get that son of a bitch Donnie, no matter what it costs." Lefty was released in April 1993 at the age of 66, suffering from lung and testicular cancer. He died in November 1994, He never reconciled with Pistone. He never forgave him. And he never spoke to the authorities. Until the end, he remained faithful to the only code he had ever known. The results of Operation Donnie Brasco were historic. Over 200 indictments, over 100 convictions of Mafia members, with sentences ranging from 20 to 100 years in prison. The Bonanno family was so devastated that it was expelled from the commission, the highest council of the five families, an unprecedented humiliation in the history of the American Mafia. The case completely redefined how the FBI conducted long-term undercover operations. Before Pistone, an operation lasting weeks was already considered too risky. After Pistone, long-term infiltrations became standard practice for the Bureau. And there was another number that haunted Pistone: $500,000. It was the value of the contract the Mafia had placed on his head, a bounty that technically still exists. Joe Pistone still lives today with his wife under a false name, at an undisclosed address. But here's the part of the story that the numbers don't tell. In a small private event following the conclusion of the operation, the FBI presented Joe Pistone with a medal for his service and a check for $500. $500 for 6 years of his life. 6 years living among murderers. 6 years without seeing his family. 6 years accumulating evidence that brought down one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. $500. And what about Joe Pistone, MC? He wrote about the psychological cost of the operation with rare honesty. He said that when he finally got out, it took him months to be able to behave normally in social situations, that he felt uncomfortable in environments that weren't the Mafia underworld, that he had to relearn how to trust people, because for 6 years, every relationship had been built on a lie. But he also wrote something that became famous. I'm proud of the fact that I was the same Joe Pistone when I left as I was when I went in. 6 years in the Mafia didn't change me. It's an extraordinary testament to resilience. But when you read about everything he went through, the nearly destroyed marriage, the isolation of his daughters who grew up without a father, the nights when he could barely remember who he really was, you realize that the line between Joe Pistone and Donnie Brasco was much thinner than he would like to admit. There is a scene that Pistone described in his memoirs that, more than any other, captures the human weight of this story. During the final days of the operation, when he already knew he was about to leave, Lefty took him out to lunch. They ate, they talked, they laughed, and at some point during that lunch, for no apparent reason, Lefty looked at Donnie and said, "You know I would die for you, Donnie. Whatever happens to me, I am responsible." Lefty was saying that he had secured Donnie's entry into the family, that if anything went wrong, he would be the one to pay the price. In Mafia parlance, it was the greatest declaration of trust a man could make, and Joe Pistone was sitting there, listening to those words, knowing that in a few days the FBI agents would reveal the truth to Sonny Black. That Lefty would be arrested or killed. That all of that, the friendship, the years, the trust, had been a carefully constructed trap. There is no FBI training that prepares an agent for this moment. The story of Donnie Brasco poses a question that doesn't have an easy answer. When a lie protects the greater good, is it still a lie? Joe Pistone spent 6 years building trust with real people. People who committed real crimes and destroyed real lives, but who were also human beings with genuine fears, affections, and bonds. Lefty was a murderer. That's a fact. He had blood on his hands, decades of violence and exploitation. And at the same time, his friendship with Donnie was real. His loyalty was real. His love, in its twisted and brutal way, was real. The operation was an extraordinary success. The Mafia never fully recovered from what Pistone did. But Joe Pistone was never completely Joe Pistone again. And Lefty Ruggiero died without receiving a single honest word from the man he considered his best friend. This is the story of Donnie Brasco. Not the Hollywood version. The real version. If this story stuck in your head, and I bet it did, leave a like here. It's simple, takes 2 seconds, and really helps to get these stories to more people. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Every week there's a new operation, a new secret, a new story that deserves to be told properly. The next one is coming, and it's even deeper.